The hospital gave him an award. He had already killed at least 40 of their patients. My name is Marg, and what you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing true crime cases in modern European history. Not because of what one man did, but because of how many people let him do it. This is the full story of Niels Hogel, a nurse, a colleague, a killer, and a man the system protected at every turn. Stay with me to the end, because the worst part of this story isn't the murders. It's what came after. Before we get into who Niels Hogel was, I want to tell you exactly what we're going to cover, because this case has layers that most coverage completely misses. We're going to go through 5 phases today. Phase 1. The man himself. Who he was before anyone suspected anything. Phase 2. The method. Specifically, how he did this inside hospitals surrounded by trained medical professionals. Phase 3. The first cracks. When people started to notice and what happened when they spoke up. Phase 4. The cover-up. And yes, that word is deliberate. And Phase 5. The reckoning, the trials, the truth, and what Germany had to confront about its own healthcare system. By the time we're done, you'll have the full picture. Not the headlines, the whole thing. Phase 4 is the one that made me angry when I researched this. I'll tell you why when we get there. Right now, before we go any further, drop a comment. Had you heard of this case before today? Yes or no? I'm genuinely curious how widely known this is outside of Germany, because the answer surprised me. Niels Hugel was born on the 30th of December 1976 in Wilhelmshaven, a coastal city in Lower Saxony, Germany. Population around 80,000. An ordinary port city. An ordinary childhood by all accounts. He wasn't a loner, he wasn't isolated. His school records don't contain any red flags that investigators later surfaced as obvious warnings. He had friends. He had a normal social life. He was, in the language that gets used in these cases, unremarkable. He decided to become a nurse in his late teens, and not just any department, intensive care. The ICU, the place where people come when they are as close to death as they can be while still being alive. Where the margin between living and dying is measured in minutes and decisions. I want you to think about that choice for a moment. The ICU isn't where you go if you want a quiet career in healthcare. It's loud, it's brutal. People die there regularly, and that's expected. That's the nature of the place. When a patient in the ICU dies, the assumption is almost always, of course they did. They were critically ill. For someone with Hogel's intentions, and we'll get to those intentions, the ICU was the perfect environment. High death rates are normal. Nobody looks twice at another death. The paperwork says natural causes and everyone moves on. He qualified and began working at the Oldenburg Clinic in Lower Saxony in the late 1990s. Within a few years, he had established a reputation, not as someone to watch out for, as someone exceptional. Colleagues described him as calm under pressure, focused, the kind of nurse you wanted beside you when a patient coded. When the machine started screaming and every second counted. He was quick, he was confident, and when a resuscitation succeeded, he was the one who'd been working it. He received commendations. He received positive performance reviews. At some point during this period, he received the award I mentioned at the start of this video, a formal recognition of his dedication to patient care. The award wasn't a coincidence. It was evidence of how completely he had hidden in plain sight. I'll come back to the award, because when you understand what was happening at the time it was given, it stops being a dark irony and starts being something far more systemic. Tell me, does this surprise you, that a killer in a hospital could receive a commendation? Or does that part somehow feel inevitable given what we know about how institutions work? Comment below. Let's talk about what Niels Hugel was actually doing, because the method matters, not for shock value, but because understanding it explains why this went on as long as it did. He was injecting patients with unprescribed medications, specifically drugs that disrupted cardiac function: ajmaline, sotalol, lidocaine, calcium chloride. All of them have legitimate medical uses. All of them, in the wrong dose or the wrong context, can throw the heart into a fatal arrhythmia. Here's what made this so insidious. Hogel wasn't simply killing patients. He was engineering medical emergencies and then attempting to reverse them. He would administer a drug to a patient. The patient would crash. Alarms would go off. A code blue would be called, and Hogel would be there, already there, working the resuscitation with the calm competence everyone admired him for. Sometimes he saved them, sometimes he didn't. When he didn't, the death was recorded as a natural deterioration. The patient was already critically ill. The cause of death was written as cardiac arrest related to the underlying condition. Nobody ordered a toxicology screen. Nobody was looking for injected medications in an ICU patient who was already receiving medications. And when he succeeded, or when the resuscitation worked, he was the hero. The skilled nurse who pulled someone back from the edge. He was manufacturing the crisis and then positioning himself as the solution to it. He didn't just hide in the hospital, he weaponized it. Investigators who later analyzed his pattern noted that he seemed to derive something from the resuscitation attempts themselves. The performance of it, the control over outcomes, the adrenaline of the emergency. Psychologists who examined him described a form of what's sometimes called hero syndrome. The need to be the person who saves the day, taken to its extreme lethal conclusion. He wasn't simply a murderer who happened to be a nurse. He was someone who had found a system, a medical system built on trust, and learned how to exploit every weakness in it. Here's the question I kept coming back to while I was researching this. At what point, with a patient who's already critically ill, does a doctor or a nurse question another injection? Comment your thoughts. I genuinely want to know what you think the practical answer is. Nothing stays hidden forever. And in Oldenburg, the first hospital, the cracks started to show. By the early 2000s, nursing staff had begun to notice something they couldn't quite name. Not formally, not in writing, but in the break room. In quiet conversations at the end of shifts. A pattern that felt wrong even if nobody could articulate exactly what it was. More patients died when Niels was on duty. Not dramatically more, and not in a way that would immediately trigger an investigation, but statistically, measurably, undeniably more. Some staff members raised concerns, not through formal channels, through informal ones. A word to a supervisor. A worry passed between colleagues. The quiet, uncomfortable suspicion that something wasn't right about the patterns clustering around one nurse. And here is where I need you to stay with me. Because what happened next is the part of this story that defines it. The Oldenburg Clinic did not investigate. They did not pull the death records. They did not cross-reference shift patterns. They did not take the informal concerns and turn them into a formal review. What they did instead was facilitate a transfer. Niels Hogel was quietly moved on. He was given a positive employment reference, a document attesting to his professional competence and dedication. And in 2003, he began work at the Delmenhorst Clinic, approximately 30 kilometers away. A reference letter, a 30-kilometer drive. Dozens of new patients who had never heard his name. I want to be precise about what that transfer represented. The Oldenburg Clinic did not confirm that Niels Hogel had done anything wrong, but they knew enough to want him gone. And rather than investigate what they suspected, they handed the problem, and him, to someone else. At Delmenhorst, the killings continued, and the death rates in the cardiac care unit climbed to levels that, in hindsight, should have been immediately flagged as statistically impossible. The word hindsight is doing a lot of work in this story. We'll get to that. I need a comment from you here. When you hear that a hospital moved someone on rather than investigating, what's your reaction? Shock? Sadly, not surprised? Tell me honestly, because the range of responses I've seen to this detail is enormous. I told you at the start that Phase 4 was the one that made me angry. Here it is. In 2005, Niels Hogel was finally caught in the act. A colleague at Delmenhorst observed him injecting a patient with a medication that had not been prescribed. That colleague reported what they saw. Hogel was arrested. And in 2006, he was convicted. 6 counts of attempted murder, He received a sentence of 7.5 years. 7.5 years for 6 attempted murders in a facility where, as we now know, the body count was already catastrophic. Here's what did not happen after that conviction. Nobody reviewed the death records at Delmenhorst. Nobody reviewed the death records at Oldenburg. Nobody went back and asked if this man was convicted of attempting to kill patients, how many patients might he have already killed? The answer was right there in the files, in the shift records, in the death certificates, in the toxicology that was never ordered because nobody thought to order it. It was all there. And nobody looked. Why? There are multiple answers to that question, and none of them are satisfying. Investigators later cited institutional inertia, the tendency of large organizations to assume that a conviction on 6 counts means the problem is solved. They cited a failure of communication between the two hospitals. They cited the assumption that the legal process had identified the full extent of the crimes. But there's another answer that the 2021 parliamentary inquiry eventually gave, and it's the one that I think tells the real story. The hospitals, both of them, were more concerned with their own reputations than with the patients who had died in their care. An investigation would mean scrutiny. Scrutiny would mean accountability. Accountability would mean admitting that this happened here, on our watch, and we missed it. So nothing happened. Hogel served part of his sentence, and the families of the people he had killed went on believing their loved ones had died of natural causes for years. The parliamentary inquiry and the trials that eventually followed gave names and faces to the statistics. Elderly patients who had come in for manageable conditions and never left. People in their 50s, 60s, 70s. Patients who were sick, yes, but whose families had believed they were in good hands. Families who received phone calls saying there had been a deterioration, a cardiac event, nothing more could be done. Those families didn't know they were being lied to, not just by Hogel, but by the institutions that closed around what he'd done and chose silence over accountability. Comment with your honest reaction to this. If you found out that a hospital had known something was wrong with a staff member and transferred them instead of reporting, and your family member died in that facility, what would you do? I'm asking because the families in this case had to fight for years just to have their questions answered. It took until 2014 for the real investigation to begin. Nearly a decade after the arrest, 8 years after the conviction. Prompted not by any internal review, not by either hospital, but by an external report that finally connected the statistical anomalies to something that demanded action. Investigators began exhuming bodies, analyzing tissue samples, reviewing death records, cross-referencing shift logs. What they found took years to fully document. The initial suspicion was dozens. The confirmed number, the number that Niels Hogel was ultimately convicted of, was 85. 85 people. Killed in hospital beds by someone who was supposed to be keeping them alive. In 2015, Hogel was tried a second time, this time specifically for murders at Delmenhorst. He was convicted of 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, and received another life sentence. But the investigation wasn't finished. In 2019, the third and most comprehensive trial began in Oldenburg. It covered 100 cases. Niels Hogel was charged with 97 counts of murder. He was convicted of 85. Sentenced to life imprisonment, with a specific determination that he should never be released. During the trial, Hogel showed something that the prosecution and the families found almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves, a selective and inconsistent account of what he remembered. Admitting to some, denying others. Unable or unwilling to give the families the full accounting they had spent years fighting for. 85 convictions. And still, the families left the courtroom without answers for every name on the list. And in 2021, the Lower Saxony State Parliament published the findings of a formal inquiry into how this had been allowed to happen. Its conclusions were damning. The inquiry found that staff at both hospitals had noticed irregularities and failed to formally report them. That the transfer from Oldenburg to Delmenhorst had been handled in a way that prioritized institutional image over patient safety. That the 2006 conviction should have triggered a retrospective review, and did not. that multiple opportunities to stop Niels Hugel had been missed, not because they were invisible, but because people chose not to look. The inquiry did not result in criminal charges against any hospital administrator. There were no institutional prosecutions. Recommendations were made, processes were reviewed, reports were filed. The families of 85 people got a life sentence for the killer. They did not get accountability from the system that enabled him. I want to come back to the award I mentioned at the start. During the period when Niels Hugel was actively killing patients, when the death rates on his shifts were climbing, when informal concerns were being whispered in break rooms, he received a formal commendation from the hospital for his dedication to patient care. I've thought about this detail a lot, and I've decided that it isn't just dark irony. The award is a symbol of exactly what made this possible. It represents the gap between what an institution shows the world and what it permits in the background. It represents the performance of safety and competence, certificates on walls, commendations in files, while the actual conditions that should have raised alarms were going unaddressed. The award didn't exist despite what was happening. It existed because of the culture that allowed what was happening to go unseen. A culture that looked at a nurse who kept showing up at the scene of emergencies, who kept being the one working the resuscitation when patients crashed, and saw excellence rather than pattern. That award is the most honest thing this story produced, because it tells you precisely what the institution was paying attention to, and what it wasn't. Every case I cover on this channel, I try to end with a question. Not just how could someone do this, but what does this case reveal about systems and structures and the invisible decisions that get made when no one is watching? The Niels Hugel case reveals something specific, that institutions designed around trust are uniquely vulnerable to people who understand how to exploit that trust, and that the first response of many institutions when that vulnerability is exposed is to protect themselves rather than the people in their care. He was able to kill 85 people not because he was invisible, but because he was seen and not questioned, trusted and not verified, transferred and not investigated. The healthcare workers who raised informal concerns did the hardest thing. They named something uncomfortable in an environment where naming uncomfortable things has real professional consequences. Some of them weren't believed, some of them were. The institutions made a different calculation, and 85 people paid for it. If there is something this case asks of us, and I think there is, it's this. When something doesn't look right, the answer is not to move it 30 kilometers away and write a positive reference. The answer is to look. If you made it to the end of this, thank you. This case took a lot to research, and it took a lot to write. The families of the people in this story spent decades trying to get the truth heard. The least I can do is tell it properly. If this is the kind of content you want more of, cases where the system is part of the story, not just the perpetrator, subscribe. Hit the bell. I release a new case every week and I don't do fluff. Every video on this channel is as thoroughly researched as this one. Drop a comment and tell me, which part of this case hit you hardest? The method? The transfer? The 8 years after the conviction? The award? I read every single comment. Every one. This channel only exists because of the people who engage with this content, and I take that seriously. And share this video. Not for the views and for the 85 names in that trial record. These people deserve to be more than a statistic in a foreign language court document. Share it so their story reaches someone new. I'll see you in the next case. Stay sharp.